Welcome to the lecture for crisis intervention. I'll be talking this time excuse me, about crises in school settings. So we'll start off talking just about some features that may be unique to the school setting as opposed to crises occurring elsewhere. Obviously, one of the most obvious things would be that the majority of potential clients are minors. Again, not all of the clients you may have led to crisis intervention in a school will be minors, because it's not just the students, right? Faculty and other staff also potentially could be affected by crises. But the majority of clients will be minors, which means that you need a good knowledge of human development. And again, uh, people develop across the lifespan, right? And so development doesn't stop with childhood like Freud thought. But developmental changes are much more rapid during childhood than adulthood. And so, the difference between an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old are more pronounced than the difference between, a 40-year-old and a 44-year-old. Right? So you really need to know about human development, about cognitive, physical, emotional, all those different things to know your clientele. And know what's normal, typical behavior, and what's atypical behavior, right? Other things related to the fact that the majority of clients are minors, it introduces a whole separate set of excuse me, ethical and legal issues that you don't have to think about as much with if clients are adults. Another thing would be this idea of shared identity, that people who attend and work at a school often share have the shared identity. They identify as part of a group, right? So when some sort of crisis precipitating event happens and affects one member of the school community, it can have a wide range of individuals may be affected, right? Because it happened to one of us, right? More so than something happens in your town. Wow, that it's kind of close to home. If it happens in your school, there again, if that's part of your identity, which it often is. There may be less psychological distance between you and a crisis if it happens in your school. Right? Bureaucracy. Schools have a unique organizational structure and usually multiple layers of policies. The school's policies, the district's policies, the state's policies, federal policy, all these different rules, which sometimes may be detrimental to crisis intervention. Sometimes rules get in the way, but sometimes it can be very helpful. The fact that you have this organizational structure and you have an opportunity to put some rules in place can be, excuse me, a very good thing for crisis intervention, also crisis prevention. Multiple roles in terms of what the school is expected to do. More so over the past few decades than originally. Schools aren't expected just to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? They're also asked to perform a lot of roles that maybe were formerly done primarily by the family, right? More of kind of raising kids and including counseling services, which makes it a complicated place to work sometimes. The one of the really nice things for crisis intervention about schools is that there's often a person in place who would probably take the lead on crisis interventions and has hopefully some good training to do that. And that would be the school counselor, right? Unfortunately, in some districts, school counselors aren't used so much as school counselors. They're used in other roles, administering TOS tests or tax tests, whatever it is now, in those things. But usually, even if they don't get to do a counseling job a lot of time, the good thing is they still usually have that training and those skills and that interest to go into that position. So that's kind of one of the good things about the school setting. And then last, this is kind of related back to the bureaucracy in terms of crisis planning. Because of the resources in schools and the organizational structure, it's possible to be proactive and plan for potential crises before they happen, right? Which allows for swifter intervention. And we'll talk more about crisis planning in schools more specifically in just a bit. First, let's talk about a couple issues that may occur in schools. One of the ones that gets a lot of attention, obviously, in the media, and for good reason, would be violence in schools. Okay, according to some thinking, it's possible to kind of create these profiles, personality profiles, character profiles of the types of individuals that will engage in violence in school settings. And when you try to create these profiles, really, what seems to emerge are excuse me, two different typologies, two different characters. The EVJO and the SVJO, the estranged violent juvenile offender and the serious violent juvenile offender, right? So your EVJO, that's your kind of loner kid, right? Who's maybe an outcast, maybe been bullied, and not regularly violent, but may have this outburst of profound violence, kind of your school shooting type. And your SVJO would be more your serious violent juvenile offender, more of your chronically violent kids that may be in gangs or may have a kind of conduct disorder where there's always getting in fights, and you're not surprised whenever they engage in violence. Thinking this way about these two different types, there's a good side and a bad side to it. The one reason that people have tried to come up with these typologies is to aid the assessment process for identification, right, of who might these people be, not kind of post-mortem looking back, okay, well, what do we know about this people, but by doing that after people have been violent, trying to profile in terms of identify kids who might be at risk for engaging in violence. Right, and in terms of these two types, they certainly have some characteristics or experiences in common that seem to distinguish them from other non-violent students. Right? For example, they both show they both may show delayed cognitive development, especially related to moral reasoning. But then there are also characteristics that may serve to differentiate between the two types. Right, the serious violent juvenile offender is more likely to have academic struggles and be non-compliant in the classroom. Whereas the estranged violent juvenile offender may have some academic difficulties, but may have good grades and may even be thought of as a good student. Right now, this isn't a problem student; they're just kind of shy and quiet. And the SVJO is typically identified due to a criminal history. If they've been arrested a couple times, well, that's a seriously violent juvenile offender. Excuse me. And the EVJO, the estranged violent juvenile offender, you can look at different characteristics, but they also may be identified practically. If you're like, wow, this person might be at risk from peer referral, because usually if before they do something violent, they will talk about it with someone, either face to face or posting stuff online. Or they might have what we call leakage, where it's like they have this violence inside, and they're trying to be secretive about it, but it kind of leaks out, and comes out in other ways that maybe not directly telling you that they're going to hurt somebody, but you can kind of tell, like if they're writing really violent stories in their English class, right, like the Virginia Tech shooter. We refer to that as leakage, where the pathology that's there becomes evident in other ways before something really bad happens. In terms of intervention, the SVJO, serious violent juvenile offender, probably more likely to use some sort of reality therapy techniques emphasizing choice. You can choose to do this, you can choose to do that, and also consequences. If you choose to do this, this is going to happen. And they may be more likely to respond well to that. With the EVJO, it suggests that the danger of violence can be greatly reduced by allowing those students to express their negative feelings and teaching them skills for improving social interaction. The idea that, especially if they're their violence isn't instrumental. It's not goal-oriented. They're not beating somebody up to get their lunch money kind of thing. They're doing it to express negative feelings because they feel angry, sad, alone, whatever, some sort of negative affect. And if you can get them to express it in some other way, and then teach them skills to connect with people, the idea is that they won't ever be violent. Whereas your SVJO, letting them talk about how angry they are, won't stop them from being violent, because they're not being violent necessarily because they're angry. They're being violent because it works. And that probably is a gross oversimplification, because even with your serious violent juvenile offenders, there's probably some emotional problems there that, if dealt with, would reduce the likelihood that they're going to want to engage in even instrumental violence. You may also deal with violent situations related to gang situations, gang settings, which has its own set of complicating factors. If you have somebody who's been the victim of some violence at the hands of a gang member, it's not as easy to tell them, well, you tell them, oh, stand up for yourself, or oh, tell somebody, right? Either one of those plans, if you say, hey, take care of this yourself, that person may very well get very seriously injured, maybe even killed. So it's a tricky situation. There is real danger involved, even with in younger kids, because often younger kids, if they're affiliated with a gang, there are older kids who are also involved, who will be very willing to carry out violent acts in the name of the group. What's important here is realizing the danger is real, and trying to cooperate as much as you can with the police, who are trained especially to deal with gangs and know the gangs in the area well. Usually there's a task force specifically targeted to deal with that. And as much as you can, obviously, you do preventative stuff. But if that hasn't been done, or it's been done but hasn't worked, you still have to deal with the problem. And the first thing to do is keep someone safe, and realize that there won't be easy answers. With bullying, and another problem that's been excuse me, garnered a lot of attention in the media lately. And it's important to realize that your intervention will obviously be with victims of bullying, but will probably also need to be with perpetrators of bullying. That they need some intervention as well to get them out of the pattern that they're engaged in. And again, it's not in a school setting. It's never as simple as simply rescuing the kid. Saying, well, I'm going to go tell those kids not to do this anymore. You do that today, and then the next day those kids come back and beat the kid up worse for ratting them out. Right, so it's about working at a school level and not trying to handle, well, we don't have a bullying problem here at the school. Here's a problem with just these kids, because it never is just these kids. There's an environment, there's a culture that supports bullying, and you really have to intervene at that level if you want to get a handle on it. Excuse me. Bereavement in schools, kind of like I've talked about before, one thing that you want to be cautious of is compulsory therapy, right? So there's a loss in the school, a student dies, a teacher, a staff member, somebody dies, and you think, okay, well, this is horrible, and the kids are going to struggle. All the kids need to be in grief groups. No, not necessarily. Just because there's a loss doesn't mean all the kids need to be in therapy or a process group. You need to do some assessment and look for kids that are having issues, and you want to have some response, obviously, when there's a loss, and talk with parents, maybe giving them some ideas about how to talk with their kids. But some kids will be just fine and not affected by it without you doing a lot of intervention. If you do a lot of intervention, then that may actually end up causing more problems with kids that wouldn't have had problems otherwise. So we don't do compulsory therapy. We assess and look for if there is a need. We also don't want to forget that it's not just the kids who are affected by a loss, right? That teachers and staff are affected too, even though they're kind of expected to be strong for the kids, which often makes it even harder for them to grieve, because they're not. It's harder for them to grieve openly, especially at school. So working with them and educating them when a loss happens about identifying problematic patterns of grief may be important. It's always important to be familiar with developmental level, but especially with dealing with grief and loss. Something we talked about in the last chapter, in terms of depending on the age and cognitive level of a kid, they have different understandings of death, and so you have to make sure you know what level they're at. In terms of intervention, again, it's the same things we talked about in the last chapter, talking about grief. Um, But it's also important in terms of the school setting to educate teachers and administrators about what to expect from the kids. Possible decreased academic performance, potential acting out behaviors, but also telling them, okay, if a kid is talking in class or getting in trouble, it may be because they're having trouble dealing with the loss. It may be just because they, are a kid that likes to talk in class or have ADHD or whatever else. So you want to talk about, consider a hypothesis that if kids are struggling immediately after some loss in the school, that it's related to it, and that might indicate that you need to call in the counselor to talk to the kid, but not necessarily. You don't want to just write it off. Well, they're getting in fights, but I'm not going to tell anybody about it because there's just a phase they're going through after this loss, and it's going to be fine. It may or may not be. Right? So, talking to them about the warning signs about kids that may be struggling. Excuse me. In terms of suicides in school settings, do things. Obviously we have suicidal students. A lot of the same stuff we talked before about suicide, but important not to be in denial about the seriousness of suicidal ideation among youth and saying, "Oh, it's just a kid being a kid," or "Oh, they're just making threats to get attention." Maybe. But maybe not. Always take it seriously. And like I said before, even kids that are kind of being manipulative in terms of talking about suicide, if they're going to make suicidal gestures, take some pills or cut a little bit without the intention of killing themselves, but to get attention, if they take it that far, they may really kill themselves when not meaning to. So it is still serious, even if it is manipulative. So always take it serious. Do a full assessment, and intervene appropriately. And working with kids because they're minors, you involve the parents and make all the appropriate notifications. And take steps to keep them safe. A little bit different from what we talked about before in terms of suicide. Excuse me, in terms of postvention in schools. This is talking about after someone has committed suicide, how to deal with the aftermath, right? And there's a bit of controversy about this, but I tend to agree with the author of your text that there is a danger of copycat suicides. And if you look at some of the epidemiological data, it suggests that that suicide rates after one person commits suicide in the community, they go up. And so it's just to avoid a rash of suicides or copycats, not to glamorize the suicide, and as maybe as painful as it may be for some, and as maybe uncaring it may seem, this means not having big memorial services for students who commit suicide. Because typically when if a kid dies, you may have a memorial service and all this stuff, and talk about you missing the person, but many researchers suggest if they died by suicide, don't do that because it sends this kind of message that, oh wow, look at all the love and caring that this person got now. So somebody who doesn't feel loved and cared for might think, well, they'll finally really think good about me and say nice things about me after I'm gone, and they fantasize about that. And again, because they aren't fully cognitively developed, they don't get that, well, if you're dead, you won't be here to see it. So that it may make them more likely to act on kind of suicidal ideation they may have. And again, it's not that somebody commits suicide and kids who are perfectly happy, healthy, all of a sudden think, wow, that seems really cool. But kids who are already a little bit at risk, this may push them further along if you kind of celebrate and glamorize the death of someone who's taken their own life. So not doing those things, and then doing a proper assessment among of risk among the survivors, and kind of being aware that, okay, we just had suicide. Let's, all the kids we thought maybe were a little at risk before, let's go back and check on them again. And then also kids who were close to that kid, let's check on them, see if they're okay, and deal with it at an individual level, and also kind of classroom by classroom, not big school-wide announcements and memorial services, things like that. Okay. Ethical and legal issues unique to schools. Excuse me. When it comes to client confidentiality, when you're working in a school setting, it, again, depends on what role you're playing. If you're the school counselor there, if you're a consulting psychologist or counselor, different rules may apply. But in general, you try to maintain confidentiality as much as possible because of ethical reasons, right? Because we believe that good counseling requires the trust that's built upon promises of confidentiality. That being said, when working with minors, they don't have the legal privilege of confidentiality, right? They do to some degree. Well, their parents are the holders of the privilege. So just because they're kids doesn't mean you can go talk to anybody about what they tell you. But it means that if their parents want to know everything they told you, then you tell the excuse me, you tell the parents everything they told you. And again, usually you try to work out some agreement if you're working with the kid for a while, and the parents. Okay, well, I'd like for them to be able to trust me, and I like to be able to have this sense of confidentiality. Are there certain things that if they tell me, I can keep it to myself, and then there are certain things that if they tell me, you definitely want to know. And let's talk about what those things are, right? And you walk through all the different possibilities. In school settings, confidentiality can be tough when you're working with the kid because often other people know that you're working with the kid, and then they'll come and ask you. Other teachers or other staff will say, "Okay, how are they doing? What'd they say? Is this problem taken care of?" And you have to be. You don't want to be a jerk about it, but you do want to be professional and within the bounds of whatever the rules are in your school. Tell them, I can't tell you. As a private matter. And usually you are going to be reporting to someone about progress, especially the principal will be wanting to know how students are doing, and even the homeroom teacher. But you're going to, again, work that out, and you're going to talk to the kid about what things you may need to share. So at least you're informing them about the limits of confidentiality. But again, you don't want to be gossiping about kids or talking about it outside of where it would be appropriate. Duty to warn, like we talked about before. In Texas, it's about contacting the appropriate authorities. Excuse me. And you also have a ethical obligation to notify the parents if a child, you identify the child is in danger of hurting themselves or someone else. But again, you're not legally obliged in Texas to warn any kind of potential victims. Excuse me. Another thing that may come up in school settings, child abuse. If a kid is in crisis, either they're struggling in school, they refer to you, they have been violent, whatever, and in the course of talking to them, you develop a suspicion that they're the victims of ongoing abuse at the hands of an adult. You're required to report that, right? And that's a tricky situation to be in, but you have an ethical and a legal, moral obligation to do what you need to do to keep that kid safe. And again, it's not that you know that they're being abused; it's you have a reasonable suspicion. That's enough to trigger the call, and it's not just you tell your boss and hope they take care of it. Hopefully, we've all learned that lesson from the Penn State scandal. You tell the authorities, right? You call CPS yourself and make that call. Excuse me. One other kind of just ethical issue. One of the guiding principles of ethics in counseling and in therapy and crisis intervention is client autonomy, right? As much as possible, we want to preserve the autonomy of our clients, and we don't want to develop unnecessary, unhelpful, untherapeutic dependencies. And this is especially challenging when you're dealing with kids, because they maybe more likely to form a dependency because they are dependent somewhat on others. And there's also a recognition that they are not fully autonomous, right? They can't completely do things for themselves. They can't decide oftentimes where they're going to live, how late they're going to stay out, those things. They are legally dependent on their parents or guardians. So it can be a tough balance to try to maintain the sense of autonomy, but realize that they don't have the same type of autonomy that adults do. So we don't want to put more on them than they're capable of handling. Excuse me. Okay, last thing we'll talk about crisis planning in schools. Again, I said that because of the resources and the structure of schools, you have the opportunity to plan for crises before they happen, have kind of these crisis plans in place, in these crises teams where people are, you've identified roles for who's going to do what when something happens, right? When developing and implementing a crisis plan, important for it to be individualized, and again, you don't want to, if you're at a school and they say, oh, can we come up with a crisis plan, you don't want to reinvent the wheel necessarily. It was like, well, geez, I wonder what we should do. Let's start brainstorming. Go out and look what other people have done, right? But you don't want to just necessarily copy somebody else's plan wholesale, because it may not fit for your particular school, your particular district, your particular university, if we're talking about college level. So you have to tailor it to your population and to your resources, right? Say, okay, well, part of our plan is we're going to make sure that they get, we're going to contact somebody to get them inpatient hospitalization, psychiatric hospitalization within 24 hours. Depending on where you're at, that may not be realistic. So you have to figure out what resources you have at your disposal, and who the players are in your area. Important for the plan to be multi-tiered. And by this I mean you have a plan usually for your school at the school level, and if it's a large school, talking about a university, you may even have a tier below that where, like at TAMUC, we have the School of Business, School of Education, and the School of Fine Arts, whatever. Anyway, the School of Education might have their own crisis intervention plan, particularly because we're at a different location than other divisions of the school. But still, at a higher level, you have some common plan. And for schools, so at a school, like an elementary school, you may have a plan for that school that's specific to that school, which will be different than the high school's plan, right? Because you have very different population. You have potentially a mobile population where kids where they could get in their cars and leave versus young kids that can't, right? So you have different rules for those things. But then you also have some commonalities, maybe at the district level, and then also even maybe at the state level, and then at the federal level, there may be some overarching guiding policies, recommendations, but probably aren't very specific at that level, and getting more specific as you move down the levels. So different rules at different levels and different people involved, usually with some overlap. So like if you have a crisis response team at your school, and there's also some sort of crisis response team for the district, at least one person from your school should be on the district's crisis response team, right? That way there's this kind of flow of communication between levels. You want the plan to be comprehensive but not overwhelming. If you have every little detail, try to spell it out, it's not going to be digestible. People are going to say, well, we've got this 400-page manual for crisis intervention. So, okay, crisis happened. Let's get out the 400-page manual. Let's find what do we do. It should cover as many possible scenarios as you could possibly anticipate, but at a level that is digestible and people kind of know clearly what to do and who's responsible for doing what. So identifying levels of responsibility, and if this person is responsible for doing this, but maybe they're in the crisis, so they're out of the loop now, you have to have this kind of flow chart. If they're gone, it goes to this person, from the president to the vice president to the leader of the House, speaker of the House, whatever. Have those contingencies in place, but again, not your 500-page government manual type thing. In terms of what kind of things they should focus on, you may not think about it like this, because we'll often think about crisis intervention being response after a crisis, but really a crisis plan, because you're making the plan before crisis happens. A large part of it should focus on prevention. So what are we going to be doing to reduce the likelihood of crises? Right? And so, excuse me, crisis plan may involve what resources you're going to have regularly in place, doing things to help kids deal with the difficulties. Obviously, you want to focus largely on security, right? And as counselors, we always think, well, we're worried about emotional well-being, and that's important. And obviously, I think it's important. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this field. But it makes no difference if you're happy or sad if you're dead. Right, so the first thing first is make sure the plan keeps everybody alive. Right? After security comes emotional well-being, but it goes in that order: alive first, and then emotional well-being. You have to have some component in there looking at media relations. Whenever something happens at a school, people are going to want to know about it. They're asking questions, and you have to be able to communicate effectively with media. And it's important to be able to use the media to help the intervention and not get in the way of it, right? So if you need to use the media to tell parents, come get your kids, to tell parents, don't come get your kids, we're on lockdown and we won't let you in, and we need to find out where the bad guys are, and if you come here, we may think you're a bad guy and the police may shoot you. Right? So we use the media to get out whatever message needs to be gotten out. So you want to plan all those types of things. And along those lines, also obviously a big focus will be communication with parents, because as much as schools are maybe put in the place of parents and expected to be parents, they're not parents, and parents are still the parents, and we want to keep not take away their power over what they think is best for their kids, which means communicating clearly with them whenever a crisis happens, and giving them as much freedom as possible to make the right choices they think they need to make for their kids. Again, as long as it doesn't endanger anybody else. Okay, for your discussion question, excuse me. We talked, a lot about schools. At least for me, I've been thinking at kind of a elementary, junior high, high school level, but a lot of stuff also applies at the university level. And one of the things that's been talked about after some of the school shootings at university campuses is maybe we need to do a better job of screening university students, and thinking about the kind of the EVGO type, the estranged violent juvenile offender. These people who maybe have some mental illness, and then are going to potentially act on some kind of tragic level of violence, with multiple victims, and keeping these people from causing harm by keeping them from attending universities. On the other side of that, you have people saying, well, if you do that and you do this kind of mental health profiling, you're going to end up denying access to people who aren't necessarily violent. Because again, there are lots of students with mental health issues that attend universities. The majority of them don't ever engage in any kind of violent acts. So unless you have some very, very good assessment where you can predict violence, at the 99.9% level, you're going to be discriminating against some people who would never have been violent. And in terms of assessment of violence and prediction, we're pretty good at predicting violent behavior on the short term. If we can assess you now, say, well, are you going to be violent in the next, hour to 2 weeks? We're pretty good at predicting that. beyond that, is this person a year from now, will they be violent? We're not very good at predicting that. Right. So we say, no, they're not violent now, but might they be violent later? Maybe, but we're not sure. The farther we get out from the time of the assessment, the less able we are to make these predictions. So my question, get to the point here, the discussion question is, do you think we should increase screenings for university students and come up with some sort of profile for violent college students, and then if people score a certain score on this profile, not admit them, not let them attend the university? Or do you say, no, that's discriminatory, we shouldn't do that? And whatever your answer is, if you would provide at least two reasons why you feel the way you do. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.